So this talk follows and is linked closely to the previous one. It's again using MRI, and in this case is to explore loss of muscle force and atrophy either from aging or disuse. So I'll presume that much of the introduction to the MRI has been done in the previous talk. So the motivation behind this was why is the loss of muscle force disproportionately greater than the loss of muscle mass? And looking at the significant determinants of loss of muscle force, neural drive has been studied well. Amount of contractile muscle tissue has also been documented, like either in loss of muscle fibers or reduced muscle diameter. What is less studied and probably has large implication for this force loss discrepancy is the remodeling of the extracellular matrix. So we saw that in the previous talk that some of the structural changes in the ECM could be documented, primarily in MR because our voxel resolutions are not high that you can go to the endomysium or even the perimysium level, but we can document the gross changes like fibrosis changes. That was what was shown in the 3D map. But I'll also show later on that using this technique of diffusion tensor imaging and an appropriate model that connects the microstructure to the gross observable changes, you can actually derive some of the microstructural parameters like fiber diameter or endomysial width. So our question was that if it's true that so many of the animal models and various experiments that have gone beforehand suggest that the force that's generated by the muscle fibers can be transmitted not just through the myotendinous junction, but laterally through the endomysium. But there has been no in vivo measurement of this lateral transmission of force for obvious reasons. It's hard to disambiguate even a single muscle force, much less the longitudinal and lateral components of it. One way to extract it could be to use computational models to see how that lateral force and longitudinal force contribute to the total force production. Our goal was that can we have an indirect measure of this LTF from the dynamic MRI that we saw before. So what the dynamic MRI gives us is basically the velocity at each point in the muscle as a function of the contractile cycle. You can also derive from that displacement. So you can either have, so as I was showing in the last presentation, you can have strains, but most of these strains that was extracted is unidimensional strain. But we know in practice the muscle is a 3D structure, so the strain has to be is actually a tensor. Just like diffusion is a tensor, strain is a tensor. That means it has components XX, but it also has components like XY and YZ. This just gives an idea of what we do to start from the acquired images to get to the final, what we call the strain rate or strain tensor images. So these are all calculations that we do from the acquired images in order to get not only the strain quantitative values, but also the directional aspects of it, because that we feel gives a very important clue on how the strain distribution is. So these are just the parameters of the scan. And just to keep in mind that this is not a real-time imaging by any means. You have to do consistent like 53 to 70 contractions in order to get the image. But we can follow it with a temporal resolution of about 130 or 100 to 130 milliseconds resolution you can follow, which is sufficient to monitor the contraction cycle. So what is done mathematically is really getting this kind of a spatial derivative. As just looking at a strain is what? Is the delta displacement by the actual length, right? Delta L by L. Since we get velocity, we opted to go for strain rate rather than for the strain tensor. So it's the same idea, is that we're taking the we are doing the change of velocity over a unit distance. And it so happens that we can only, as of now, we are mostly collecting one slice. You could collect several slices in repeat experiments, but that means one has to do these repeat 70 contractions. Say you do 7 slices, that's a lot of contractions for someone to execute consistently. And this is the slice that actually that is seen as a function of the contraction cycle. So you can see how the muscle is moving, and especially the region of interest that's shown over here, you can see how that is displaced, right? And that gives you an idea of how the muscle is deforming. If it's just directly moving, then the whole ROI would move up and down without deformation. Clearly that the muscle is deforming can be seen in these regions of interest. The red lines are fascicles that we actually identified on one of these images. This is a poor man's way of getting the fascicles, but I'll come later to how you can do voxel-based identification of the fascicle direction. But essentially then we are extracting this component called the strain rate tensor, and in that what we have is what we found to our surprise was we would have thought that the maximum contraction should be along the fiber, right? But that's not what we saw. What we saw was that the maximum contraction, so if you mathematically get these values and look at where the direction of the maximum contraction is, it always had a consistent direction angle to the muscle fiber direction. That means the maximum contraction occurred in a direction that was not exactly the fiber direction itself. And this one kind of shows is a map of those orientations. This is the orientation of this contraction at the peak of the contraction cycle, and this is perpendicular to it. So you have one like this. So you can think of the muscle is incompressible, contracts in one direction, it should expand in the other direction, right? So one value is negative, denoting contraction in the direction, and the other value is positive, meaning deformation, expansion in the perpendicular direction. Then you might ask what is that only in one direction, after all it's a cross section, right? So you should have another, so along the cross section you have an orthogonal direction which also should expand, and that we don't have, since we have only one slice, we don't have a 3 by 3 tensor, we only have a 2 by 2 tensor, and we infer the out of plane component. And just to make it a little shorter, this whole discussion, I'll just give some main highlights from this. This is for the young, and this is for the old subjects. And you can, and this is the value of the strain rate along the fiber direction as a function of the contraction cycle. And this one is in the in-plane direction. What we found was that the deformation is not symmetric. That means when it in the fiber cross section it does expand, but it will expand non-uniformly. That means it mostly expands in the plane of the fibers that I showed, and it expands very little in the orthogonal direction. It's probably related to the fact that there might be some tensile materials like the costumers that provide a constraint for this to expand in the perpendicular direction. So we took the idea a little further that, so the goal had been to see whether there's anything that was related to lateral transmission of force, right? So expanding on the older model, what we had a little more detailed model. This is the muscle fiber, the cylinder in between, and this is shown, the sheath is the endomysium. So our hypothesis was, as the fiber compresses, the endomysium is pulled along with it, and one end of it is fixed. So let's say that this is surrounded by fibers that are not contracting, and this is the contracting fiber. So there's a shear, right? One side is fixed, the other side is moving with the muscle. So we were wondering whether we can get this shear strain. So then what we measured was, so initially what I showed before was the shear strain measured with what's called the principal basis. That means we are deliberately orienting the tensor so that we are only looking at the components that are along the maximal directions. Mathematically, if you rotate it by 45 degrees, what we can get is the maximum shear strain in this voxel. Where the origin of the shear strain is not known, at least from MRI, because you are not able to distinguish between a muscle fiber and endomysium within the voxel. There are at least thousands of fibers running through a voxel. But the computational models that explored what happens to non-terminating, terminating fibers. That means these fibers don't span the aponeurosis. They kind of terminate mid-belly. Then is that force from that fiber, how is it transmitted to the myotendinous junction, to the tendon? And from the model, it appears that the shear in the endomysium is responsible for transferring the force from a terminating fiber to the tendon. So our hypothesis is that the shear strain that we see from the measurements should be related at least in some measure to the lateral transmission of force. So these are the calculated images that you see here. So this one is, when I said negative eigenvalue, that means it refers to all the compressions. So during the phase in which compression is taking place, this would relate to the SR fiber. In the second half of the cycle, it will relate to the orthogonal direction. But you can see this is the young and old. Just even visually, you can see this is higher values than in this one. And especially the shear strain is much higher than if you look at what it is in the older subjects. So though we don't have a direct correlation or proof that what we are measuring as shear strain is lateral transmission of force, at least the computational model gives us a bridge to link these two components. And when we try to see what the correlation of these strain rate indices was with the MVC, so we pulled together the young and old subjects, and you can see that in a multivariate analysis, the strain rate indices that came out to be significantly associated with force loss was two SR indices. One was the shear strain, and the other one was SRCC, and though I didn't explain it, but it's related to the strain or the deformation in the perpendicular direction. And as I kind of alluded to before, this strain in the perpendicular direction is also related to the costomeres or some proteins in the extracellular matrix, right? So it does appear that at least in this analysis where we only explored these indices as their association with force loss, that the two indices that are related to the endomysium and could potentially be modulating the lateral transmission of force are significantly associated with force loss. And we got related results, you could say, for the limb suspension model as well. So again, just briefly here, what of these strain rate features were associated with loss of force with suspension? Again, SR in plane. So you would think the first thing should jump out at you is SR fiber, right? Contractility of the muscle fiber itself. But that doesn't seem to be as associated as much as the SR in plane, that means the deformation in the in-plane direction. And this again could be related to the fact that if the endomysium becomes stiffer or there's some disruption of the costomeres, that may be somehow modulating the deformation in the perpendicular direction, thus limiting the force or limiting the force transmission pathways. So not only the in-plane, but also the FC max, you can see here, the shear strain. So shear strain seems to come out as an important association with either force loss with age or force loss with suspension. The next couple of slides are all related to works in progress. So another index of interest for us is fiber aligned strain rate, and that means trying to see what the strain is along the actual muscle fibers. I showed earlier that we did rotate it to the fibers, but the fiber direction was grossly found out from the fascicle directions. But as the previous speaker had said that we actually have the potential of getting the fiber direction at every voxel. So this analysis is to rotate the strain rate tensor to the basis of the diffusion tensor, so that at every point we know what the strain rates are along the fiber and along the cross section of the fiber. So that's one area of ongoing work. Another one is volumetric strain, and as I said before, one limitation has been that we could only acquire, not that we could only acquire a slice, but it was prohibitive for people to do 6 or 7 slices. But we did acquire in one set of data several slices, so that we can get not just the 2D tensor but the full 3D tensor. So we also know what the orthogonal direction really is instead of inferring it. And we kind of want to see what is volumetric strain, because it's, you might think there should be no volumetric strain, right? Because if the muscle is incompressible, then any deformation in one direction should be balanced by the deformations in the other direction, keeping the volume constant. But there is a finite volumetric strain even from the observed data, and it may be important because it's related to intramuscular pressure, which other studies have shown by having intramuscularly pressure sensors inserted into the muscle, that this pressure correlates with the tension, muscle tension. So we may have a method of actually measuring single muscle forces by looking at the volumetric strain. But still, this is works in progress. So one of the biggest limitations in MR, not just in velocity encoded, is the speed of MR is always slow. So compared to ultrasound, these are minute scans instead of second scans. So this is one method we are looking at, which is called compressed sensing imaging, which is actually something that has revolutionized MR, because this is a way in which you can speed up the scans without compromising resolution or introducing artifacts into the image. So I won't go into it. What it has actually helped us or is going to help us do is reduce the scan time from 70 contractions to maybe 15 contractions or even less. So it's a combination of random undersampling of the data or random undersampled acquisitions and multiple coil imaging. So that's another one area. The last one that I'll just touch upon is the goal for diffusion tensor imaging had been fiber tracking. So if we can get the fibers, get the length and penial angle, that basically gives you the fiber architecture at the macro level. But what's more exciting is that can you actually tie all these gross parameters you're measuring to microstructural parameters that reflect things that you can never measure with MR directly, right? So this is one of the models that we propose. It's called random permeability model. This is just a schematic of how the muscle looks in 2 dimensions. But what it gives you a handle is that you can actually look at things like, you can have, so it's the model itself links the observed, like the lambda 1, the eigenvalues, to parameters on the scale where this is membrane permeability. You never measure, you cannot measure a membrane permeability with MR, but from the diffusion experiments you can fit to the model and get membrane permeability. There's a membrane characteristic time, effective volume fraction, which is also related to the diameter of the fiber itself. So we had so that also required some new kind of pulse sequences which probe the diffusion at different diffusion times. So you can imagine that you probe it longer, then it's probably going to hit the cell walls and be affected by that quantity. So from that we've been able to extract some things like, and this still works in progress, so not attach too much meaning to the actual values, but this is the diameter, let's say, of the fiber. It's a little less than what we would have thought. It's about 45 microns for the medial gastrocs. Then we get the diffusion, the permeability of the membrane. So we can make conclusions between, let's say this was between young and senior, so what's happening to the muscle fiber at a microscopic level as well, which was not possible before. So we want to tie all these together to get a complete picture of how the extracellular matrix contributes to muscle force loss, both from a structural and a functional viewpoint.
I'm always impressed by the way the octopus moves, and I wonder if in your model you are able to simulate hydraulic movement of fluid within the muscle structure. You said that muscle is incompressible. That's true because it's basically water.
Yeah.
But, so you showed that strain rate was mainly in the direction of the fibers, whereas you had thought it might be orthogonal.
No, we thought
Is
that.
that a pneumatic, or is that a hydraulic explanation?
Partly hydraulic because of the incompressible nature.
But if water can flow more easily along the fibers than across them, which is true, that's
It
the
is
basis
true.
of
Yeah, that's the basis. Yeah.
then does that explain how the strain rates?
Oh, no. What I was saying was, we would have thought that the contraction would be maximum along the fiber, right?
Yes.
But the axis of contraction was rotated away from the fiber. And one of the reasons we think is because of the shear.
I mean, that's the strange part. I mean, here's a fiber, it's exerting force. You'd expect the fiber to contract and therefore the strain to be maximum along the fiber direction. Instead, we find that the direction of the maximum contraction is tilted away. And it is the extent to which it is tilted away depends on whether the guy is young or 8 years senior. And the amount of deposition of ECM and so on. And that's where we believe that that's a biomarker of the amount of extracellular matrix that's present and the way it changes the direction of the exertion of the force.
Yes, I agree completely. But if you think in the extreme, the octopus uses a method where the direction of contraction of the fibers is almost unrelated
Yes.
to the movement of the tentacles.
No, I mean,
So it's a similar.
Right.
Physics-wise, I mean, that thought experiment should be relatively straightforward. One has to tweak the right time scale to the rate at which water would flow in the tentacles of an octopus. Those matching of the time scales is kind of important. I mean, this is rapid Brownian motion, and you are seeing at it as she showed, you are varying the time scale out there. The octopus, in one of my earliest slides, I actually showed flow through a pipe which is in seconds and so on.
Yeah.
You can thereby actually tweak the time scale at which you observe that. Not that you have absolute flexibility, but you can definitely design an experiment to look at fluid flow at different velocities. When you look at aortic flow, for example, that's about 120 centimeter per second. When we look at muscle flow, that's more like 5 centimeter per second. So we managed to tweak the rate at which we are taking the photos so that we can see velocities of the order of 5 centimeter per second. There's a limit to how slow the motion can be that we can observe because it ties up with the hardware of the MRI. But over that entire scale, we can match so that you can actually see each of these. Fetal movement, for example. We can see the fetal movement, and this is not too different, not physiologically, but in terms of the physics of the motion to the octopus. Yes, you can actually.
But what you're saying is it contracts in one direction but moves. Is that your thing? Your question is.
Your explanation is because the forces are redistributed by the extracellular matrix.
Right, yeah.
To change the angle.
But that may not be what's happening in the octopus, right?
Well, I think yes, it's similar, but
Similar.
You also have to think of how fluid is flowing within spaces within the tentacle. Sorry, I don't mean to.
Right. No, I mean probably it is because the volumetric strain that we are observing that could be related to how much fluid is actually flowing out of those, right, when it's compressed. Yeah, that could be related.
We probably don't have time, but
Maybe
sorry.
another question there.
It's not a question, just a comment. I'd like to emphasize some of the findings of Chantal and Usha Sinha. They showed that the out-of-plane signal is reduced in the elderly. This is alleged to represent a decrease in lateral force transmission. We know that from animal studies that lateral force transmission is fundamental for the transmission of force by the muscle.
Right, and we're trying to quantify that as much as possible. In fact, this next grant, we are also going to correlate that with biopsy results and find the exact correlation.
There are other questions. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And we move to the next presentation.